line, we have Invex Therapeutics. Invex Therapeutics is a biopharmaceutical company focused on the repurposing of an already approved drug, Exenatide, for efficacious, I can't say it right now, a treatment of neurological conditions. It sounds like I may have a condition with that there, derived from or involving raised intracranial pressure such as idiopathic intracranial hypertension, acute stroke, and traumatic brain injury. Invex has trademarked its repurposed Exenatide as Presendin. Dr. Loveridge is a founder of Invex Therapeutics and currently CEO of 4SC AG, a German-listed oncology company. He has more than 30 years of international experience across Europe, Asia, and the US in senior management positions in life sciences companies and as an investment professional, dealing in both privately held and publicly traded companies. Additionally, Jason has substantial transactional experience in the sale and partnering of biotech assets. Great to have you on the line all the way from London, Jason. Please take it away for us.
Thanks, Laura. Thanks for that introduction. And thanks everybody for joining us here this afternoon your time, this morning my time, to give a little presentation on Invex, which should take about 15 minutes. And then we'll open the line, I think, for questions, and happy to take questions. As a public company, I have to give you the usual disclaimer, which you can read at your leisure, but I won't read through for you. And we move straight on to a little bit about Invex itself. So Invex was founded a couple of years ago now, and it was based on some very fundamental work done by Professor Alex Sinclair at the University of Birmingham in understanding the very basic mechanisms by which pressure is regulated in your brain. We're working on a drug called Exenatide. Exenatide was initially developed for type 2 diabetes by AstraZeneca, brought to market in 2 forms. And we like this drug because Professor Sinclair has already shown that it can regulate intracranial pressure in a number of animal models. And it has a very extensive and long safety database. So it's a very appropriate drug to develop for a chronic condition like intracranial pressure. So as Laura said, our focus is on neurological conditions characterized by raised intracranial pressure. And our initial target is a disease called idiopathic intracranial hypertension, for which I'll just refer to as IIH from now on, because it's rather a bit of a mouthful. So IIH is a growing indication, but an orphan indication. And we have been granted orphan drug designation for Exenatide in IIH in both the United States and Europe. There are no approved drugs in IIH, and so patients have no options at the moment. We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. And it is a fairly extensive market. The most important near-term catalyst for Invex will be our phase 2 study, which we expect to publish data for in mid-May. And I'll talk a little bit about that study later on. So from a sort of ASX point of view, the company was listed on the ASX in July last year. I won't go through everything on this slide, just to point out a couple of key points, which is that the major shareholders, directors and management own 20% of the company, and the top 20 constitutes more than 70% of the company. We have some very good shareholders in Minderoo, which is the family office of Andrew Forrest, and the directors own, including myself, a large portion of the company. We have around 55 million shares on issue currently. So a little bit more about IIH. So what is idiopathic intracranial hypertension? It's a disease that's characterized by debilitating chronic daily headaches, and in some cases, severe vision impairment. So around 25% of patients that have IIH can actually lose their vision completely. So it's a very serious disease for these patients. The defining diagnostic signal for patients is to have this raised intracranial pressure, but to have no identifiable cause, hence the idiopathic. So all other causes of raised intracranial pressure, such as a brain tumor or a hemorrhage, some sort of infection. These are all eliminated in the diagnostic process. And if there are no other causes, then you have IH. This is mainly a disease of women. So 90% of patients are women and they are typically obese. The disease can last for many years. Some patients have this really their whole life. So it significantly reduces their quality of life. Incidence is growing, and in recent years, clinician awareness and diagnosis has improved. So a number of international guidelines were published in 2018, and the lead author on all of these guidelines was Professor Sinclair. So I think in Professor Sinclair, we have a very sort of key opinion leader in the IIH space involved intrinsically with the company. A little bit more on the diagnosis. It is a relatively straightforward diagnosis. It's not a hard disease to diagnose. Patients present with these headaches or with vision. They're examined for a vision impairment, undergo brain imaging to see whether they have a problem that is causing the pressure other than IH. The pressure is measured using a procedure called a lumbar puncture. And the pressure has to be above a certain number, 25 nominally, and hence the diagnosis of idiopathic intracranial hypertension. So patients can present very broadly. Some of them go to their optometrist with a reduction in visual field. Some of them turn up at their GP with chronic headaches. Some of them go direct to A&E because the onset of the disease can sometimes be quite acute. No matter what happens or how they present, all of these patients end up being treated by a neuro-ophthalmologist for the indication. And that would be our target physician group when we eventually come to market. As I said earlier, IIH is a growing disease. Although it's an orphan indication, it's driven in part at least by the increase in obesity that we see in all Western countries. So 90% of IIH patients are obese and 90% of patients are women. It's a very costly disease to the health system because patients aren't getting any effective treatment and have to return to see clinicians and be treated in hospital on a number of different occasions. And this is what adds to the overall treatment burden of the disease. And if you look at the rising incidence on the lower left-hand graph, you can see that it's increasing in line with the level of obesity in Western countries. So what are the options available to patients who have IIH? And to be honest, they're extremely limited. So patients can be triaged into effectively two groups, either those with no immediate threat to vision or those with a vision which is deteriorating rapidly. And in those patients where vision is deteriorating rapidly, these patients will undergo a sort of lumbar drain to immediately reduce pressure. And then they might sometimes have an optic nerve fenestration, which is a kind of a protection for the optic nerve. Or they might have a sort of stent placed in their brain to permanently, or not permanently, but to reduce the pressure over a longer period of time. The problem with these stents, apart from not being particularly something that anyone would want to do, is that they tend to get blocked. They tend to get infected. And so more than 50% of these stents are removed very rapidly. So it's a way of relieving pressure in these patients very quickly, but it's not an effective treatment. It's certainly not a long-term treatment. So for the other, I would say, larger group representing roughly 90% of patients where there's no immediate threat to a patient's vision, these patients will, in the first instance, be told to lose weight. So as most of you will know, I mean, being told to lose weight is one thing and losing weight is another. These women that have the disease are, very large, and it is very difficult for them to just lose weight. And there's quite a number of clinical studies that have shown that it is a challenge, and not only is it a challenge, but for those patients that do manage to lose weight, they tend to regain the weight very quickly over the long period of time. So at the moment, patients are prescribed a drug called acetazolamide, and this is not an approved drug in this indication. So it's never been tested in a large randomized clinical study, and the data has never been of high enough quality to actually gain approval from regulatory authorities. So it's a type of therapy that is given to patients because actually there's nothing else to give them. And there is some anecdotal evidence in the literature that it can reduce intracranial pressure. Patients will be given acetazolamide, and they'll be treated with this over, when I say the longer term, again, the vast majority of patients can't tolerate acetazolamide, and they come off the drug very, very quickly, sometimes within a month of going on treatment. So at the moment, you can see there are very little options for these patients. And this is why we think if we can develop a drug which is effective in this indication, there'll be a large demand, not only from clinicians, but from the patient groups themselves. So what is the size of the market for IIH? And on this slide, what we've tried to do is construct a model for what we think the market might look like. Now, normally you would have a competing drug and you can say, well, okay, such and such a drug in this market sold such and such last year, and we would hope to capture some part of that market. But in IIH, you have no precedence and you have no approved drugs. So we have to sort of go at it in a different way, and we go at it from a sort of a bottom-up way to try and calculate the population and then make some estimates of how much of that population we might treat. So if we look at the annual incidence of the disease in the US and in Europe, we're looking at around about 40,000 patients. So this is 40,000 new patients every year. And these are the part of the population that diagnose. So maybe there's around 40% of patients that are undiagnosed and don't seek treatment for their IH. So this 40,000 patients, we believe, based on some literature done from a range of clinical studies, is that around 60% of the market is currently diagnosed. And that's something we would want to improve upon through education with the patient groups. And I think we can increase the number of patients seeking treatment if we can provide an effective treatment. And I believe that around 40% of patients are not diagnosed simply because there are no therapeutic options for these patients. So 40,000 patients, 60% are diagnosed, and around 90% of those patients get drug treatment, i.e. acetazolamide. So we have around about 21,000 newly diagnosed patients, and then 4.3 years is the estimated duration of disease. Again, I think we've been quite conservative here. The patients that we know in our conversations with clinicians get treated for, or at least they go to their clinician for a long period of time. But 4.3 years is what's in the literature, so that's what we're using in this calculation. But we know that this number would go up considerably if there was an effective therapy. So the other part of the population we need to consider is the patients that are already there, part of the pool, and are not being newly diagnosed. And when you bring all of this together, you get a number around about 100,000 patients. But again, we believe this is an underestimate. $1,500 per month was chosen as the pricing for this drug. So it's not a highly priced drug. It's a chronic drug being treated over a long period of time. Exenatide currently markets for around about $600 to $800 if you're a diabetic. And so we've chosen a very conservative multiple when you consider that most repurposing of orphan indications can result in price changes from the original drug up to over 100-fold, and on average 60-fold. Here we're talking about really just doubling the price. So here it's a very conservative estimate on price. And this gives you a range in terms of the market size for around about 400 million Australian up to about 1.5 billion. So it's a very significant market for a company like Invex. So why are we repurposing Exenatide for IH? As I said earlier, it was approved for diabetes in 2005 and 2006, and it's currently marketed as either Byetta or Bydureon by AstraZeneca. It's a very well-tolerated drug. It's been literally used in millions of diabetic patients, and there's a huge safety database of patients using Exenatide chronically. So this is a significant advantage in the drug development process because it prevents us, or let's say we don't need to do a lot of the normal safety studies because this data has already been established and we can piggyback in terms of our regulatory strategy. We have patented, or when we licensed the program from University of Birmingham, we actually assigned the IP. So unlike a lot of smaller companies, we haven't taken a license to the original intellectual property. We actually purchased it. That IP has been assigned to Invex. So there are no royalty streams or downstream milestones that's due on this IP. It is the companies alone to exploit, which we think is important, not only from a commercial point of view, but it allows us to prosecute the IP in the best way possible. So Exenatide for diabetes is at the back end of its commercial life and is currently selling around about 650 million US. For Exenatide, we know that GLP-1 receptors, which are the receptor targeted by Exenatide, are present in the brain, in a region of the brain called the choroid plexus. And this is the very fundamental work that was done by Professor Sinclair in establishing that it was the choroid plexus that was responsible for regulating intracranial pressure, and that Exenatide could actually be delivered subcutaneously and make its way to the brain. Now, I know people will, often a common question is, well, how does it get across the brain? Because, you know, there are many difficulties with treating neurological diseases systemically. And the reason we don't have an issue here is because actually the choroid plexus sits outside of the blood-brain barrier. So systemic delivery works extremely effective in this particular patient group. So the reformulation strategy is laid out here. Exenatide at the current diabetic dose, we are testing in a phase 2 study to demonstrate proof of concept in IH. This is not an optimal dose, and we believe that that dose can be improved significantly for the IH indication. This is because the half-life of Exenatide when you deliver it is very short. So you inject it, and less than 2.5 hours later, all that Exenatide that you've injected has been cleared from the blood, and you have no more drug in your system, which is clearly not a particularly useful set of kinetics for a drug that's got to try and control intracranial pressure for a 24-hour period and over a long period of time. So we are currently developing a novel and patented formulation. So we actually submitted patents on the new formulation around about 6 weeks ago. This formulation provides an exposure to exenatide over a 24-hour period, which we believe will be efficacious in this indication. And it will reduce the side effect that you get with Byetta, which is that many patients who take high doses of Byetta actually suffer from quite significant nausea. So the purpose of repurposing exenatide is to make it fit for purpose in a different indication, to provide a higher dose over a 24-hour period to control intracranial pressure and not to have the side effects that you see with Byetta. So here we feel there is very little risk of off-label use, first and foremost because the Byetta or Bydureon, which is a week-long formulation, are not appropriate drugs for IH, and they're not approved in this indication. So if Presendin, which is our formulation of exenatide, is approved, this will be the preferred drug for use in IH. So the phase 2 proof of concept design is laid out in this slide. It's a high quality standard study. It's a randomized, double-blinded, placebo-controlled clinical study. And we expect to present the data from this study in not so many weeks, around the middle of May, hopefully. So it's a study in 16 IIH patients. And the important part about this study is that all patients had a real-time ICP measurement. So for the purposes of the study, they had a sensor implanted in their brain, which allowed us to measure ICP on a real-time basis. Patients were randomized 1-to-1, with patients either receiving a placebo or exenatide 10 micrograms twice a day. The endpoints for the study are laid out in the lower part of the slide. So the primary endpoint is actually 3 endpoints. It's a change in intracranial pressure at 2.5 hours, 24 hours, and 12 weeks. And the aim of this endpoint is to show that exenatide can reduce intracranial pressure in IH, and that the underlying mechanism of action is confirmed in patients, that GLP-1 activity actually drives ICP reduction. The other endpoints that we're looking at are exploratory, and the idea here is to look at some more clinical endpoints, not a physical measurement like ICP, but a clinical benefit measurement like reduction in headache or improvement in vision, to try and see what endpoints we would use in a phase 3 study. So the advantage of being an orphan indication, or one of the key advantages of being an orphan indication, is that we don't need to run 2 phase 3 studies to get approval for our drug. We can run a single phase 3 study, and that study will be based on the outcomes of this particular phase 2 study. So at the moment, we have sought scientific advice from both the EMA, so the European Medicines Agency, and the FDA in the US. And we hope to present this data to them later on the year and seek some advice on the design for the phase 3. So the secondary endpoints, the exploratory, here we're looking at headache frequency, severity and duration, use of analgesics. If you've got fewer headaches, if your headaches are not as bad, then hopefully you'll see a reduction in the use of painkillers. And then we're looking at some vision endpoints like visual field. So how wide is your visual field? Does it become, in these patients, it becomes very narrow. And we want to see what the impact of that is on visual, and also on visual acuity. And visual acuity is how well you see it. So it's that chart with the letters on it, so that you can actually, what do you see? And then some OCT measurements, which is a way of looking at the optic nerve to see what's going on there. I think obviously the study is powered to meet the primary endpoint. It's not powered to see the exploratory endpoints. So we're looking for really a trend on the secondary endpoints. But we'll see that data in a couple of weeks, and we'll be presenting that to investors at the time. So as I mentioned earlier, Exenatide benefits from orphan drug designation in US and Europe for IH. And as I said, the big advantage is the single pivotal phase 3 study required. So this reduces your time to market very substantially and reduces your cost of getting to market very substantially. I think the other key advantage is that you have both 7 years in the United States and 10 years in the European Union marketing exclusivity. So for Exenatide or Presendin, which is our reformulated drug, we have 3 layers of protection. We have both orphan drug designation, meaning that we get this 7 or 10 years market exclusivity in these key markets. We have the original IP that was assigned from Birmingham for the use of Exenatide in IH. So it's a very broad patent. And then we have a 3rd layer, which is the very specific formulation patents. So we have a very well protected intellectual property should we show efficacy in our chosen indications. When we look at orphan drugs commercially, they do tend to attract a premium pricing. And as I said in my earlier slide, pricing on average increases around 60 times for repurposed drugs from the original disease they were used to treat. And as I said earlier, our model is really only constructed on a 2-fold change in price. So here we're being extremely conservative, and I'm quite sure we'll be able to get a better price if we have good clinical data. Obviously, there are also other benefits such as lower fees and greater regulatory access, which help the development process and move the programs quicker to market. So a lot of people show this at the beginning. We've sort of chosen to show it at the end. Who are the key people in Invex? So here are a little bit of background on the founders. So in Alex Sinclair, I think we have a really genuine KOL. And I think, companies talk about KOLs a lot and mention, how they have this KOL or that KOL. But I mean, I think here Alex really is exceptional in this particular field. And most important, she's been the key author in defining all of the international and European treatment guidelines, which were published in 2018. She is the lead investigator on our phase 2 study. And she has an incredibly broad network of people that she's worked with treating patients with IH. She sits on the board of the International Headache Society and on the North American Neuro-Ophthalmology Society. And I think, in Alex, she really is a leader in the IH space. I think Laura gave you a little bit of background on myself earlier, just at the start of the presentation. Suffice it to say, I actually am Australian. I was born in Sydney, but I've lived outside of Australia for a long period of time now, working in the pharmaceutical space for more than 30 years, both as an investor with a number of different venture funds and as CEO of a number of companies where these companies have been sold to large pharma along the way. And I think, our goal with Invex is really to develop Exenatide for IH, to look at least one other indication, and then to look for a partner or potentially a buyer of the company who can really commercialize the drug over the longer term. So in terms of key milestones as we go forward, obviously the most immediate milestone is the phase 2 data, which will come out around the middle of May. Then we have a number of other steps before we can finally, in the first half of next year, initiate our phase 3 registration study for Presendin in IH. We need to finalize that design with the regulators, and we hope to do that in the next 6 months. We need to do a small animal PK study and a tolerability study. The tolerability is a skin tolerability because the drug will be delivered subcutaneously. We'll do a human PK study. So this means effectively putting the drug into a healthy volunteer and looking at the pharmacokinetics. How long does it take for the drug to go from the blood? How long does it stick around? And we can compare this with Exenatide as Byetta, which is very helpful. And then, as I said before, we will aim to initiate a second indication, which I think at the moment will probably be a variant of IH called IH, but without papilledema. And the reason we would choose this is that we can use the exact same formulation that we're using for IH in this indication. And therefore we can move forward very quickly with the second indication. So I think the key thing here is the phase 2 data, and that will be coming out in a matter of weeks. This slide just serves to try and compare the company with other companies, for example, on the ASX, and what makes us different. We have a repurposed but proprietary drug with orphan designation in the US and Europe. And we have a proven mechanism of action. So we understand how the drug works. We understand what the receptor is the drug binds. We understand where those receptors are. And we understand what those receptors do with respect to reducing intracranial pressure. And that's a very, very important distinction because often mechanisms are poorly understood. Because it's a repurposed drug, it's been in really millions of patients. And so there is a very large safety database. And when we look at the clinical endpoints, we want to choose clinical endpoints that are already well recognized by regulatory agencies. So overall, this gives us, I think, a lower clinical risk profile, so a higher chance of getting to market. And when we get to market, there is no approved current standard of care in this indication. So we don't need to compare to another drug. When we run our study, we will be able to compare to placebo. And we have no competing drugs already on market against which we need to show a difference. The phase 2 data will come out quite soon, and there's a number of companies that I think have sort of similar business models or similar qualities. So in summary, we have a large growing market in IH with no approved or cleared efficacious treatments. We have orphan drug designation, which provides a cost-effective and rapid way of getting to market, and then commercial exclusivity for up to 10 years. We have a major milestone, which is imminent, the phase 2 data in mid-May. We have a clinical second indication, which can be targeted using the same drug same formulation that we use for IH. And the Presendin formulation, we expect to enter a phase 3 study in 2021. At our current market cap, I believe we have a modest enterprise value and ability to deliver good returns for investors over the coming years with some key milestones in the very near future. And the potential for either some form of transaction with a large pharma, where I've done many of these in the past, both from the investor point of view and from the CEO point of view. And with that, I'll finish and hand back to Laura. And if there's any questions, I'll be happy to take those.
Thanks so much, Jason, for that comprehensive overview. We do have a couple of questions for you. What is your cash balance and what is the current burn rate for the company?
So the cash balance is around just over 10 million currently. I think it's shown on this slide, yes, down the bottom.
10.4.
So the spend at the moment has really been very low. The directors of the company not taking very high salaries. And we've been doing a lot of the reformulation work. So we're spending literally in the hundreds of thousands per month, low hundreds of thousands per month. This will increase as we get into the back half of this year and 2021 with the clinical work. So if we get to our phase 3 study, there'll be a significant rise in burn as we start the preparation for that study.
And year on year, how does that burn rate compare, say, to this time last year?
Well, this time last year, we weren't a public company. So it's difficult to compare, but I would say it hasn't changed very much between, say, April last year and April this year.
Fair enough. On patents now, Jason, you did speak a fair bit about that. You did purchase your IP from the University of Birmingham, which does seem to be a differentiator for the company. What is the current status? I know you covered this, but just to cap off again, someone has this question about what is the current status of the company's Exenatide patent applications in the US and the EU? And is there now a change as well in your strategy to push new patents for the newly reformulated Presendin in the same indications?
Sure. So we did purchase or have assigned 3 pieces of IP from Birmingham, which cover the use of Exenatide in IH. That was in Japan, in the US, and in Europe. And Japan, we had granted at the end of or early 2020. In the US and Europe, both of these patent applications are ongoing through prosecution. So we're going through the normal process of debating with the examiner about the claims, and those are in process. It's difficult to say when those will reach a conclusion, probably sometime in 2020, but you can't be sure. So that's where we stand on those 2 pieces of IP. On the strategy, I don't think anything's changed. What we're trying to do is provide the strongest level of protection that we can for Presendin and exploit every opportunity we have to create some form of defense. So as I said, we have the Orphan drug designation, which is critical. We have the initial IP assigned from Birmingham, and we have the new formulation. And if we look at other indications, for example, outside of IH, we will probably utilize a different formulation, and we'll apply for new IP on those particular formulations as well.
So there is a lot going on with the company, and we're also wondering, well, someone was wondering who was watching at home, the company has made a mention of a capital raising to fund further work in another indication apart from IH, that given the coronavirus outbreak, raising capital in the market could be quite fraught at the moment. Have you considered the timing of such a capital raising to minimize dilution for your existing shareholders?
Well, clearly the responsibility of the board is to try and create value for shareholders. Raising funds is always dilutive by definition if it's some form of equity. If we want to run a phase 3 study, we will need additional capital. So we don't have sufficient capital on hand to complete a phase 3 study. So I think if we get good data in our phase 2 and can move forward at some point, it would be sensible to ensure that we have enough cash on hand to get the company right through to the market. And that, I believe, would be the best strategy to create value for all shareholders. And I myself am a large shareholder in the company, so I'm very cognizant of dilution. I sit alongside of everybody else that has a share in this company, and I'm very keen to minimize dilution for myself as well as for everybody else. I'm also keen to move things forward as quickly as possible, because at the end of the day, this is really how value is created in these companies.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's balancing the priorities, isn't it? Thank you so much for joining us on the call all the way from London today, Jason. Great to have you on board with the conference.
It's a pleasure. Thanks very much, Laura. Enjoy your evening.
Thank you. Enjoy your day. Talk soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
And thank you everyone for joining us on today's call. We obviously are running another virtual investor health conference next Monday. So you can catch many more companies on that one. And that's at 9 a.m. Monday with presentations from PainCheck, Hand Group, Aventis Medical, Dimerix, Microba, Antisense Therapeutics, Volpara Health Technologies, Respiratory, Oncosil Medical, and Immutep. You can visit the website, which is in the chat section, for more details. Thank you. We'll see you again next week.